They say age is just a number, but I learned that winter morning in Hamilton County Courthouse that some people see those numbers as a weapon to be used against you. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, I believed that respect was something you earned through decades of hard work, community service, and treating others with dignity. I thought that owning property free and clear for over 40 years meant something in this country. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right about one thing. I raised my voice loud enough in that courtroom to make a man half my age realize that this old lady had teeth sharper than his expensive legal briefs and a memory that could recall every dirty trick he thought I was too senile to notice. What he didn't know was that this retired schoolteacher had spent 45 years dealing with bullies much smarter than him, and I'd kept every receipt, every document, and every piece of evidence that would prove he'd made the biggest mistake of his career when he decided to target the wrong woman. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that people will show you their true colors when they think you're powerless, when they see your silver hair and your sensible shoes, and assume you don't understand contracts or legal proceedings or the way business really works in the modern world. They see your age spots and your slower pace and think you're just another confused elderly person who can be intimidated into signing papers you don't understand. They look at your modest clothes and your quiet demeanor and assume you're financially vulnerable, socially isolated, and legally naive. But sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone dismisses. Sometimes the soft-spoken grandmother with the careful handwriting is the one who's been documenting every conversation, saving every letter, and building a case that will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you'll wish you'd never heard her name. This is my story. This is about the day a hotshot real estate developer learned that Margaret Thompson wasn't the helpless widow he thought she was. This is about the moment when 72 years of life experience crashed against 45 years of arrogance and greed. This is about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, age for incompetence, and assumes that being female and elderly automatically makes you a victim. My story begins long before that courtroom confrontation. Long before I found myself fighting for my home and my dignity against a man who thought my age made me an easy target. It begins 43 years ago when Robert and I first walked through the front door of the Victorian house on Maple Street that would become our sanctuary, our investment, and eventually the battlefield where I would make my stand. I was 29, then fresh out of college with my teaching degree, and married to a man who believed that a woman's dreams were just as important as his own. Robert worked as an electrician for the city, and I had just been hired at Willowbrook Elementary School to teach third grade. We had saved every penny for 3 years to afford the down payment on that house, a beautiful 1890s Victorian that had been neglected by its previous owners but had good bones and endless potential. The house sat on a double lot at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, with mature oak trees that provided shade in the summer, and a garden space that I immediately envisioned filled with tomatoes and roses. It needed work. The plumbing was ancient, the electrical system was a fire hazard, and the roof leaked in at least 6 places. But Robert was handy with tools, and I had inherited my mother's gift for making any space feel like home. We spent every weekend for the first 2 years renovating that house. Robert rewired the entire electrical system and replumbed the kitchen and bathrooms, while I stripped wallpaper, refinished hardwood floors, and painted every room twice until the colors were exactly right. We converted the large basement into Robert's workshop and the small attic space into my reading nook where I could grade papers and plan lessons in peaceful quiet. The neighborhood was different then, filled with young families like ours and older couples who had raised their children in these same houses and were now watching grandchildren play in the same yards where their own kids had learned to ride bicycles. Mrs. Kowalski next door taught me how to grow prize-winning tomatoes, and Mr. Peterson across the street showed Robert the proper way to maintain the vintage gutters that came with houses built before anyone had heard of seamless aluminum. I loved teaching at Willowbrook Elementary. The school was only 6 blocks from our house, so I could walk to work even in the winter. And the principal, Dorothy Harrison, believed in giving teachers the freedom to be creative with their curriculum, as long as the children were learning. I developed a reputation for being able to reach the difficult students, the ones other teachers dismissed as troublemakers or slow learners. I seemed to have a gift for seeing past behavioral problems to the curiosity and intelligence that was hiding underneath. Robert and I talked about having children of our own, but somehow it never happened. We tried for several years, went through the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages, and eventually accepted that our family would consist of just the 2 of us and the hundreds of children who passed through my classroom over the decades. It wasn't the life we had originally planned, but it was a good life, filled with meaningful work and genuine happiness. The house became our masterpiece over the years. We added a screened porch off the kitchen where we could eat breakfast while watching birds visit the feeders Robert installed throughout the backyard. We converted the old carriage house into a pottery studio where I learned to throw clay on weekends and during summer vacations. We planted fruit trees and built raised beds for vegetables and created a small paradise that reflected 40 years of love and careful attention to detail. Robert died suddenly of a heart attack when I was 68, 3 years after we had both retired. I found him in his workshop on a Tuesday morning, slumped over the workbench where he had been building birdhouses to donate to the elementary school's annual fundraiser. The paramedics said he probably didn't suffer, that it had happened too quickly for pain or fear, but that knowledge didn't make the grief any easier to bear. The funeral was standing room only at St. Mark's Methodist Church. Former students who were now adults with children of their own came to pay their respects to the teacher who had believed in them when no one else would. Neighbors brought casseroles and flowers and shared memories of Robert fixing their plumbing emergencies and helping them move furniture, and always being available when someone needed an extra pair of hands. After the funeral, everyone kept telling me how sorry they were for my loss and asking what I planned to do now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The implication was clear. Surely I couldn't manage that big house by myself. Surely I would want to move somewhere smaller and more manageable. Surely I would sell and relocate to a retirement community where I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and yard work and all the responsibilities that came with homeownership. But I had no intention of leaving the house that Robert and I had spent 4 decades turning into our dream home. I hired a lawn service to handle the heavy yard work and found a handyman who could take care of repairs that required more strength than I possessed. But otherwise, I was perfectly capable of maintaining the property that held every happy memory of my married life. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Most of the original families had moved away or passed on, and the younger people who bought their houses worked in the city and commuted to jobs that kept them busy and distracted. I didn't mind the lack of close relationships with my newer neighbors. I had my memories and my books and my pottery and the satisfaction of knowing that I was living independently in the home I loved. It was about 6 months after Robert's death that I first encountered Brad Henley. He appeared at my front door on a Saturday morning in early spring, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He was tall and confident in the way that men who have never been told no often are, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that was designed to be charming, but somehow felt calculating instead. He introduced himself as a real estate developer who was working on an exciting project in the neighborhood and wondered if I might have a few minutes to discuss a business proposition that could be very lucrative for both of us. His tone was friendly but patronizing, the way people speak to children or elderly relatives they assume can't understand complex concepts. I invited him in because I had been raised to be polite to visitors, and because I was curious about what kind of proposition he thought a retired schoolteacher might be interested in. He sat in Robert's favorite armchair without being invited and began explaining that he represented Henley Development Corporation, a company that specialized in bringing modern commercial developments to underutilized residential areas. According to Brad, My property and the 3 houses adjacent to it were perfectly positioned for a shopping complex that would serve the growing population of young professionals who were moving to Willowbrook but currently had to drive 20 minutes to find decent restaurants and retail options. He painted a picture of a vibrant commercial district that would bring jobs and tax revenue to the community while providing convenient services that residents desperately needed. The way he described it, I would be doing a service to the entire town by selling my property to his company. He mentioned the challenges of maintaining an older home, the expense of heating and cooling such a large space, the physical demands of yard work and home repairs that would only become more difficult as I aged. He suggested that the smart financial move would be to sell while the market was strong and use the proceeds to purchase a nice condominium or apartment where I could enjoy my golden years without the burden of homeownership. When I asked him what he was prepared to offer for my property, he quoted a figure that was approximately 60% of what the house and land were actually worth. When I pointed out that his offer seemed low, he smiled indulgently and explained that residential properties in transitional neighborhoods often appeared to be worth more than their actual market value because homeowners became emotionally attached and lost perspective on realistic pricing. He suggested that I might want to have the property appraised by a professional, but warned me that most appraisers would factor in the age of the house and the cost of necessary repairs and arrive at a figure very similar to his offer. He also mentioned that if I waited too long to make a decision, property values in the area might decline as other homeowners accepted offers from developers and the residential character of the neighborhood changed. I told him I would need time to consider his proposal, and he left me with a folder full of glossy brochures showing other projects his company had completed. The brochures featured beautiful photographs of modern shopping centers with upscale restaurants and boutique stores surrounded by landscaping that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than real life. After he left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to process what had just happened. On one level, I understood that development was inevitable in a growing community like Willowbrook. The town had been expanding steadily for the past decade as people sought affordable housing within commuting distance of the city, and commercial development naturally followed residential growth. But something about Brad Henley's presentation had bothered me. It wasn't just his assumption that I would be eager to sell, or his condescending tone when he discussed the challenges of aging homeowners. It was his casual dismissal of my property's value and his suggestion that I was too emotionally invested to understand its true worth. I had been managing the household finances for 43 years. I knew exactly what our house was worth because I had been monitoring property values in the neighborhood for decades. I understood real estate markets because I had watched Willowbrook grow and change and had seen how development patterns affected property values throughout the town. I wasn't some confused widow who could be manipulated into accepting below-market offers because I didn't understand business. The next week, I called 3 different real estate agents and asked them to provide written appraisals of my property. All 3 estimates came back within $5,000 of each other, and all 3 were significantly higher than Brad Henley's offer. The highest appraisal valued my house and land at nearly double what he had proposed to pay. I also did some research on Henley Development Corporation and discovered that Brad's company had a pattern of targeting older homeowners in transitional neighborhoods, making lowball offers, and using various forms of pressure to convince people to sell quickly before they had time to research the true value of their properties. Several newspaper articles described complaints from elderly residents who felt they had been deceived or coerced into selling family homes for much less than they were worth. When Brad called the following week to follow up on his offer, I told him that I had decided not to sell. I explained that the property had been appraised at significantly more than his proposed purchase price, and that I was perfectly content to continue living in my home for the foreseeable future. His response revealed a side of his personality that he had kept hidden during our initial meeting. The friendly charm disappeared, replaced by a tone of frustrated irritation that suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his offers rejected. He told me that I was making a mistake, that property values in the area were likely to decline as development pressure increased, and that I might not receive another offer as generous as his. When I pointed out that his offer hadn't been particularly generous compared to current market values, he became more aggressive. He suggested that I was being unrealistic about my situation, that maintaining an old house was going to become increasingly expensive and difficult, and that I was too emotionally attached to the property to make rational financial decisions. He also mentioned that my neighbors were likely to sell their properties to developers eventually, and that I would find myself living next to construction sites and commercial buildings that would destroy the residential character I was trying to preserve. He painted a picture of me as a stubborn old woman holding out against inevitable progress, creating problems for myself and everyone around me. I ended the conversation politely but firmly, reiterating that I had no interest in selling and asking him not to contact me again regarding his development project. I thought that would be the end of our interaction, but I was wrong about Brad Henley's persistence and his willingness to use increasingly unethical tactics to get what he wanted. Over the next several months, I began receiving letters from various organizations claiming to represent the interests of elderly homeowners. These letters warned about the challenges of aging in place, the financial risks of owning property that required expensive maintenance, and the importance of making wise decisions about housing before cognitive decline made such decisions more difficult. The letters were carefully crafted to appear helpful and informative, but they all contained subtle suggestions that I should consider selling my home while I was still capable of managing the transaction independently. They included statistics about home accidents involving elderly residents, stories about seniors who had been victimized by repair scams, and warnings about the isolation that could result from living alone in houses that were too large for one person to maintain safely. I recognized these letters for what they were: a coordinated campaign designed to make me doubt my ability to continue living independently and to create anxiety about my decision to remain in my home. The return addresses were different, but the message was consistent, and I suspected that Brad Henley was behind the entire operation. My suspicions were confirmed when I began receiving phone calls from people claiming to be social workers, home health aides, and elder care specialists who had heard that I might be interested in learning about housing options that would be more appropriate for someone my age. These callers were invariably polite and concerned, but they all seemed to have been given the same talking points about the risks and challenges of aging in place. When I asked how they had gotten my contact information, they gave vague answers about referrals from community organizations or public records research. When I told them I wasn't interested in their services, they expressed concern about my decision to reject help that could improve my safety and quality of life. The most disturbing call came from someone claiming to represent Adult Protective Services, who said they had received reports about an elderly woman who might be living in unsafe conditions and refusing necessary assistance. When I asked for more specific information about these reports, the caller became evasive and suggested that someone would need to conduct a home visit to assess my situation and ensure that I was capable of caring for myself adequately. That phone call made me angry in a way that I hadn't experienced since I was a young teacher dealing with parents who tried to bully me into changing their children's grades. I realized that Brad Henley had moved beyond simple sales pressure into harassment and intimidation tactics designed to make me feel vulnerable and incompetent. I decided it was time to fight back, but I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I could formulate an effective response. I called Sarah Chen, a lawyer who had handled Robert's estate planning and who I knew specialized in elder law issues. Sarah was a sharp woman in her 40s who had built her practice around protecting seniors from various forms of abuse and exploitation. When I described the pattern of pressure I had been experiencing, Sarah's expression grew increasingly serious. She explained that what I was experiencing was a form of elder abuse called predatory real estate practices that targeted older homeowners who appeared vulnerable to manipulation and coercion. According to Sarah, developers like Brad Henley often use sophisticated psychological pressure campaigns to convince elderly property owners that they were incapable of maintaining their homes and needed to sell quickly before their situations became worse. These campaigns frequently included fake referrals to social services, manufactured safety concerns, and coordinated contact from multiple sources designed to create a sense of crisis and urgency. Sarah told me that such practices were illegal under both state elder abuse statutes and federal fair housing laws. But they were often difficult to prosecute because the victims were elderly people who might not be taken seriously by law enforcement, or who might be embarrassed to admit they had been targeted. She asked if I would be willing to document all future contact from Brad Henley or anyone associated with his development project, and she suggested that we begin building a case for harassment and elder abuse that could result in significant legal consequences for his company. I agreed immediately. 45 years of teaching had given me excellent organizational skills and a natural inclination to document everything carefully. I had already been saving the letters and recording details about the phone calls, but now I began approaching the situation like the research project it had become. I installed a phone recording system that would capture all incoming calls. I created files for every piece of correspondence I received, and I began taking detailed notes about every interaction I had with anyone who mentioned my housing situation or suggested that I might need assistance with decision-making. I also began researching Brad Henley and his company more thoroughly, using skills I had developed over decades of helping students with research projects and investigating complaints from parents who questioned my teaching methods. What I discovered was a pattern of behavior that was even more disturbing than I had initially realized. Henley Development Corporation had been the subject of multiple complaints filed with the State Attorney General's Office, the Better Business Bureau, and various consumer protection agencies. Former employees had described a corporate culture that encouraged aggressive sales tactics and specifically targeted elderly property owners who were perceived as easier to manipulate than younger, more sophisticated buyers. Several lawsuits had been filed against the company by families who claimed their elderly relatives had been pressured into selling valuable properties for below-market prices through campaigns of harassment and intimidation. Most of these lawsuits had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements that prevented the details from becoming public, but the pattern was clear. I also discovered that Brad Henley had a personal history of using questionable tactics in his business dealings. He had been censured by the State Real Estate Commission for misrepresenting property values to elderly clients, and he had been named in several ethics complaints filed by other real estate professionals who objected to his business practices. The more I learned about Brad Henley, the more determined I became to not only resist his pressure campaign, but to build a case that would expose his illegal behavior and protect other elderly homeowners from becoming his victims. I was no longer just defending my right to live in my own home. I was fighting for every older person who had been targeted by predators who saw age as weakness and assumed that senior citizens were too confused or frightened to fight back effectively. Brad Henley had made the mistake of targeting a woman who had spent 45 years dealing with bullies, who understood how to research and document evidence, and who had access to legal resources that most elderly people couldn't afford. He was about to learn that Margaret Thompson was not the helpless victim he had assumed her to be. The harassment escalated dramatically over the following weeks, transforming from subtle pressure into what could only be described as a coordinated assault on my peace of mind and sense of security. Brad Henley had apparently decided that if charm and reasonable offers wouldn't work, intimidation and fear might be more effective tools for convincing me to sell. The first sign that his tactics were becoming more aggressive came in the form of an official-looking letter from something called the Willowbrook Property Assessment Division, informing me that my home had been flagged for a mandatory safety inspection due to concerns about the structural integrity of older residential buildings in the neighborhood. The letter was printed on professional letterhead and included references to municipal codes and inspection requirements that sounded legitimate but felt somehow off. I called the real Willowbrook City offices to inquire about this inspection notice, and the clerk I spoke with had no record of any such assessment division or any pending inspections in my neighborhood. When I described the letter, she suggested that it might be fraudulent and recommended that I report it to the police department's fraud investigation unit. That same week, I received a call from someone claiming to be from my homeowner's insurance company who said they needed to schedule an inspection of my property to verify that it still met their coverage requirements. The caller explained that they had received reports suggesting that the house might have developed structural problems or safety hazards that could affect my policy eligibility. When I asked for the caller's name and employee identification number so I could verify the legitimacy of the request, he became evasive and suggested that I might be confused about my insurance arrangements. He implied that elderly policyholders sometimes forgot about scheduled inspections or misunderstood the terms of their coverage. I hung up and immediately called my actual insurance agent, who confirmed that no inspection had been scheduled and that my policy was in good standing with no outstanding issues or concerns. She was disturbed to hear about the fraudulent call and offered to document the incident for potential legal action. The pattern became clear. Someone was systematically attempting to create the impression that my home was unsafe, that I was incapable of managing my affairs properly, and that various official agencies were concerned about my living situation. Each contact was designed to chip away at my confidence and create doubt about my ability to continue living independently. But the most disturbing incident occurred on a Thursday afternoon when I returned from grocery shopping to find a van parked in my driveway with Senior Safety Services painted on the side. Two men in matching uniforms were walking around my house, taking photographs and making notes on clipboards. When I approached them and asked what they were doing on my property, they explained that they were conducting a routine safety assessment of homes owned by seniors in the neighborhood. They claimed to be working with local social services to identify potential hazards that could pose risks to elderly residents. I told them I had not requested any assessment and asked them to leave my property immediately. One of the men, a large fellow with a condescending smile, suggested that I might not remember authorizing the inspection and that it was common for older homeowners to forget about arrangements they had made for their own protection. He showed me a clipboard with what appeared to be an official work order bearing my name and address, along with a signature that was supposed to be mine but looked nothing like my actual handwriting. When I pointed out that the signature was obviously forged, he became more aggressive and implied that my inability to recognize my own signature might be evidence of cognitive decline that warranted further investigation. The second man continued taking photographs while his partner kept me engaged in conversation, documenting what he claimed were safety violations, including loose porch railings, cracked sidewalk sections, and overgrown vegetation that could pose trip hazards. None of these supposed violations actually existed, but he photographed my property from angles that made normal wear and maintenance issues look more serious than they were. I ordered both men to leave my property immediately and threatened to call the police if they didn't comply. They departed, but not before the larger man handed me a business card and suggested that I might want to consider their recommendations about making my home safer before someone got hurt and I faced liability issues. The business card listed a phone number and address for Senior Safety Services. But when I researched the company later, I discovered that no such business was registered with the state or listed in any legitimate business directories. The address on the card turned out to be a vacant office building, and the phone number was disconnected. That evening, I called Sarah Chen and described the incident in detail. She was outraged and explained that what I had experienced was criminal trespassing combined with fraud and elder abuse. She immediately began preparing paperwork to seek a restraining order against Brad Henley and his associates, and she advised me to install security cameras around my property to document any future intrusions. Sarah also suggested that we contact the state attorney general's office to file a formal complaint about the pattern of harassment I was experiencing. She explained that elder abuse cases were often difficult to prosecute because they relied on testimony from older victims who might not be perceived as credible witnesses, but my careful documentation and professional background would make me a more compelling plaintiff than most. The next morning, I was awakened at 6 o'clock by the sound of construction equipment starting up in the vacant lot behind my house. I looked out my bedroom window to see 3 large trucks and a crew of workers who appeared to be preparing to begin some kind of excavation project. I got dressed quickly and went outside to investigate, where I discovered that someone had posted official-looking notices claiming that the lot had been designated for emergency utility repairs that would require heavy machinery operation between 6 in the morning and 10 at night for an indefinite period. The notices included warnings about noise, dust, and potential disruption to surrounding properties, along with contact information for complaints or questions. When I called the number provided, I reached a recorded message suggesting that residents who were disturbed by the construction might want to consider temporary relocation until the project was completed. I immediately called the city utilities department, which had no record of any emergency repairs scheduled for the area. The lot in question was privately owned and had been vacant for several years with no approved construction permits or utility work orders. When I confronted the construction crew and told them they were working without proper permits, the foreman showed me paperwork that appeared to authorize the work, but contained several obvious discrepancies, including incorrect property descriptions and missing official seals. He suggested that I was confused about municipal procedures and that elderly residents often misunderstood construction notifications. I took photographs of the equipment, the workers, and the fraudulent permits, then called the police to report the illegal construction activity. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes and confirmed that the work was not authorized and that the permits were counterfeit. The construction crew departed quickly when confronted by law enforcement, but not before the foreman approached me and suggested that I might be able to avoid future disruptions by working with developers who were interested in purchasing properties in the neighborhood for legitimate commercial projects. This incident was the final straw that convinced me Brad Henley had moved beyond harassment into outright criminal behavior. The fake construction project had been designed to make my home unlivable through constant noise and disruption, forcing me to either relocate temporarily or sell the property to escape the intolerable conditions. I realized that Brad had systematically researched my situation and developed a comprehensive campaign to make me believe that continuing to live in my home was impossible. He had attacked my sense of safety, my confidence in my decision-making abilities, and my basic right to peaceful enjoyment of my property. But what Brad didn't understand was that 45 years of teaching had given me extensive experience dealing with bullies who used intimidation tactics to get their way. I had faced down aggressive parents, manipulative administrators, and disruptive students who thought they could overwhelm me with pressure and threats. I knew how to stand my ground when I was right, and I knew how to fight back when someone tried to abuse their power. More importantly, Brad had made the mistake of targeting someone who understood how to document evidence, research legal options, and build a case for prosecution. My teaching career had required me to maintain detailed records, communicate effectively with authorities, and present complex information in ways that were clear and convincing. I spent the weekend organizing all the evidence I had collected: the fraudulent letters, recordings of harassing phone calls, photographs of the fake construction project, business cards from non-existent companies, and detailed notes about every incident that had occurred since Brad first knocked on my door. The pattern that emerged was even more systematic and malicious than I had initially realized. Brad Henley had orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare designed to convince me that I was incompetent, unsafe, and surrounded by threats, that only he could help me escape by purchasing my property. He had used fake official notices to create the impression that my home was subject to various regulatory problems, fraudulent service calls to suggest that I was confused about my insurance and utility arrangements, and criminal trespass to manufacture safety concerns that didn't actually exist. Each incident had been carefully designed to exploit common fears that elderly people have about aging in place. Concerns about home maintenance, worries about cognitive decline, anxiety about safety and security, and fear of becoming a burden on family or community resources. But Brad had underestimated the resilience and intelligence of his target. Instead of becoming frightened and desperate to sell, I had become angry and determined to expose his illegal activities. Instead of doubting my competence, I had gained confidence in my ability to fight back against someone who thought my age made me vulnerable. Monday morning, I called Sarah Chen and asked her to schedule a meeting where we could review all the evidence I had collected and discuss legal options for stopping Brad's harassment campaign. I also asked her to research the possibility of filing a civil lawsuit for damages related to the stress and disruption I had experienced. Sarah was impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation and the clear pattern of illegal behavior that the evidence revealed. She explained that I had grounds for multiple legal actions, including criminal charges for fraud, trespassing, and elder abuse, as well as civil claims for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of fair housing laws. She suggested that we begin by seeking an emergency restraining order that would prohibit Brad and his associates from contacting me or coming near my property. If he violated the restraining order, he could be arrested and prosecuted for contempt of court, which would give us additional leverage in negotiating a resolution to the situation. Sarah also recommended that we file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, which had a special unit dedicated to investigating elder abuse cases. The Attorney General's office had the resources to conduct a comprehensive investigation of Brad's business practices and could potentially file criminal charges that would carry serious penalties, including fines and imprisonment. While Sarah began preparing the legal paperwork, I decided to conduct some additional research into Brad Henley's background and business operations. I wanted to understand exactly who I was dealing with and whether other people had been victimized by similar harassment campaigns. I started by searching online for information about Henley Development Corporation and its various business activities. What I discovered was a company that had been operating for about 8 years with a pattern of aggressive expansion into suburban markets, where residential properties could be acquired cheaply and converted into commercial developments. The company's website featured glossy photographs of completed projects and testimonials from satisfied clients, but deeper research revealed a more troubling picture. Multiple consumer protection agencies had received complaints about Henley Development's business practices, particularly their treatment of elderly property owners. I found newspaper articles describing several cases where the company had been accused of using high-pressure tactics to convince older homeowners to sell their properties for below-market prices. In each case, the homeowners had been subjected to campaigns of harassment and intimidation designed to make them believe that selling was their only option. One particularly disturbing article described an 80-year-old man who had been convinced to sell his family farm to Henley Development after being told that the property was contaminated with hazardous chemicals and that he could face legal liability if he didn't address the supposed environmental problems. The contamination turned out to be completely fabricated, but the man had already signed the sale papers and lost his home. Another article detailed the experience of a widow who had been pressured into selling her house after Brad Henley's associates convinced her that the property was structurally unsound and posed safety risks that could result in serious injury or death. Engineering inspections conducted after the sale revealed that the house was actually in excellent condition with no structural problems whatsoever. These articles confirmed what I had suspected. I was not Brad Henley's first elderly victim, and I probably wouldn't be his last unless someone took action to stop his predatory business practices. The pattern was always the same: identify older homeowners living alone in valuable properties, manufacture crises and safety concerns to create fear and urgency, then offer to solve the problems by purchasing the property at below-market prices. Most of his victims had been successfully intimidated into selling because they lacked the resources or knowledge necessary to fight back against his sophisticated harassment campaigns. They had been isolated, frightened, and convinced that they had no choice but to accept his offers as the solution to problems that he had created. But I was different from his previous targets in several important ways. I had professional experience dealing with manipulation and intimidation. I understood how to research and document evidence, and I had access to legal representation that most elderly people couldn't afford. Most importantly, I was angry rather than frightened, and I was determined to fight back rather than surrender. Tuesday morning, I received a phone call that initially seemed to represent a new escalation in Brad's harassment campaign, but actually provided me with the most valuable piece of evidence I had collected so far. The caller identified herself as Linda Morrison, who claimed to be my neighbor from 2 streets over, and said she was concerned about reports she had heard regarding problems with my property. Linda explained that she had been contacted by someone from a development company who said they were trying to help elderly residents in the neighborhood address safety issues with their homes. This person had specifically mentioned my house as an example of a property where the owner was struggling with maintenance problems and might need assistance making decisions about her living situation. What made this conversation different from the previous harassment calls was that Linda Morrison was actually my neighbor, and she was genuinely concerned about my welfare rather than trying to manipulate me into selling. She had called because she wanted to make sure I was okay and to offer help if I needed it. When I explained to Linda what had actually been happening, that I was the target of a harassment campaign designed to pressure me into selling my property, she was outraged and immediately offered to serve as a witness to corroborate my account of the fraudulent contacts and illegal activities. Even more importantly, Linda revealed that she and several other neighbors had been approached by Brad Henley's associates with similar stories about elderly residents in the area who were having problems managing their properties. The associates had been gathering information about older homeowners, asking questions about their family situations, their health status, and their financial circumstances. Linda had found these inquiries intrusive and inappropriate, but she hadn't realized they were part of a systematic campaign to identify vulnerable targets for harassment and fraud. When I described the pattern of illegal activities I had experienced, she immediately recognized the connection and offered to help me gather testimony from other neighbors who had been contacted. This conversation was a turning point in my case, because it proved that Brad Henley's activities weren't limited to harassing me individually. He was conducting a neighborhood-wide operation to identify and target elderly property owners who could be manipulated into selling their homes under false pretenses. I asked Linda if she would be willing to provide a written statement about her contacts with Brad's associates, and she agreed immediately. She also offered to reach out to other neighbors who might have been approached and ask them to document their experiences as well. Within a week, Linda had collected statements from 5 other residents who had been contacted by people claiming to represent various organizations interested in helping elderly homeowners address property maintenance and safety issues. All of these contacts had followed the same pattern: expressions of concern about older residents, requests for personal information, and suggestions that certain homeowners might benefit from professional assistance with decision-making. The statements from my neighbors provided crucial corroboration for my claims about Brad Henley's systematic harassment campaign. They proved that his activities were part of a broader pattern of illegal behavior, rather than isolated incidents that could be dismissed as misunderstandings or coincidences. Armed with this additional evidence, Sarah Chen was able to strengthen our legal case significantly. She filed an emergency motion for a restraining order that included not only protection for me, but also an injunction prohibiting Brad and his associates from conducting their fraudulent survey activities in the neighborhood. The hearing for the restraining order was scheduled for the following Friday, and Sarah warned me that Brad would probably attend with his own attorney to contest our allegations. She explained that he would likely claim that all of his contacts with me had been legitimate business communications and that I was misinterpreting normal sales activities as harassment. I told Sarah I was prepared to face Brad in court and present my evidence in whatever format the judge required. 45 years of teaching had given me extensive experience speaking in front of groups, presenting complex information clearly, and maintaining my composure under pressure. What Brad Henley didn't know was that he was about to face a woman who had spent decades dealing with people who thought they could intimidate her into changing her mind. He was about to discover that Margaret Thompson wasn't the confused, frightened victim he had assumed her to be. The night before the hearing, I reviewed all of my evidence one more time and practiced presenting the key points of my case in a clear, logical sequence. I wanted to make sure the judge understood not only what Brad had done to me personally, but also the broader pattern of illegal activities that threatened other elderly residents in the community. I also spent time thinking about what this case represented beyond my individual situation. If Brad Henley succeeded in pressuring me into selling my home through fraud and intimidation, he would continue targeting other older adults who were even more vulnerable than I was. If I could stop him now, I might prevent future victims from experiencing the stress and trauma that he had put me through. This wasn't just about my right to live in my own home anymore. It had become about protecting other elderly people from predators who saw age as weakness and assumed that senior citizens were too confused or frightened to fight back effectively. Friday morning, I dressed carefully in my best navy blue suit and the pearl earrings that Robert had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. I wanted to look professional and competent when I testified about Brad's illegal activities, and I wanted the judge to see me as a credible witness rather than a confused elderly woman who might be misremembering or exaggerating events. Sarah met me at the courthouse and reviewed our strategy one more time. She would present the legal arguments about why the restraining order was necessary, and I would testify about the specific incidents that had occurred. We had organized all of our evidence in chronological order and prepared exhibits that would help illustrate the pattern of harassment and intimidation. When we entered the courtroom, I saw Brad Henley sitting at the defendant's table with an expensive-looking attorney who was reviewing a stack of papers. Brad was dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, and he looked confident and relaxed, as if he expected this hearing to be nothing more than a minor inconvenience. When he saw me, he smiled in that same patronizing way he had used during our first meeting, as if he still believed I was just a confused old woman who didn't understand the realities of modern business. That smile made me even more determined to show him exactly what this old woman was capable of when she decided to fight back. The judge called our case, and Sarah stood to present our motion for the restraining order. She outlined the pattern of harassment and intimidation that I had experienced, the evidence we had collected to document Brad's illegal activities, and the testimony from neighbors who had been subjected to similar fraudulent contacts. When it was Brad's attorney's turn to respond, he argued that all of his clients' communications with me had been legitimate business inquiries and that I was misinterpreting normal real estate marketing activities as harassment. He suggested that elderly homeowners sometimes became confused about business transactions and developed unrealistic perceptions about the motivations of people who were trying to help them. Then the judge asked me to take the witness stand and describe my experiences in my own words. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the opportunity to tell my story directly to someone who had the power to stop Brad Henley's predatory behavior. I looked across the courtroom at Brad, who was still wearing that condescending smile, and I began to speak. I stood up slowly, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the witness stand with the same steady pace I had used when approaching the front of my classroom for 4.5 decades. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly yellowish tint, but the atmosphere was unmistakably serious and formal. As I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I caught sight of Brad Henley leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, that familiar smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. His body language conveyed complete confidence that this elderly schoolteacher would stumble through her testimony, contradict herself, or become confused under questioning. He was about to learn that he had seriously underestimated both my memory and my ability to present complex information clearly and persuasively. Judge Patricia Wakefield was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation for being thorough but fair, and she was known for her patience with elderly witnesses and her intolerance for attorneys who tried to intimidate or confuse older plaintiffs. "Mrs. Thompson," she said in a voice that was both authoritative and kind, "please tell the court in your own words about your interactions with Mr. Henley and his associates." I took a deep breath and began with the first visit, describing in detail how Brad had appeared at my door with his expensive suit and leather briefcase, how he had made himself comfortable in Robert's chair without being invited, and how he had immediately begun pressuring me to sell my home for significantly less than its appraised value. I explained how his initial approach had combined false concern for my welfare with condescending assumptions about my ability to manage my own affairs. I quoted his exact words about elderly homeowners becoming emotionally attached to their properties and losing perspective on realistic pricing, and I described how his tone had changed from friendly to aggressive when I declined his offer. As I spoke, I watched Brad's expression gradually shift from confident amusement to uncomfortable surprise. He had apparently expected me to give a rambling, confused account that would be easy to discredit, but instead, I was providing a clear, chronological narrative with specific details that painted a damning picture of his behavior. I continued with the harassment campaign that had followed my refusal to sell, describing each fraudulent letter, every threatening phone call, and all the fake official notices that had been designed to convince me that my home was unsafe and that I was incapable of living independently. I had brought copies of everything, organized in a thick binder with tabs marking each type of illegal activity. When I reached the incident with the fake safety inspectors, I could see Judge Wakefield's expression growing increasingly stern. I described how the two men had trespassed on my property, taken photographs without permission, and showed me forged documents that were supposed to authorize their presence. I explained how they had tried to gaslight me by claiming I had forgotten arranging the inspection and suggesting that my inability to recognize the obviously fake signature was evidence of cognitive decline. "Did you report this incident to the police?" Judge Wakefield asked. "Yes, Your Honor. I have the police report number and the names of the responding officers if you would like to verify the details." I saw Brad shift uncomfortably in his seat as he realized that I had documented everything and that there would be official records to corroborate my testimony. His attorney was taking notes furiously, probably trying to figure out how to explain away the criminal trespassing and document forgery. I moved on to the fake construction project, describing how I had been awakened at 6 a.m. by heavy machinery, and how workers with fraudulent permits had tried to convince me that they were conducting legitimate utility repairs. I explained how the construction foreman had suggested that I could avoid future disruptions by working with developers who were interested in purchasing neighborhood properties. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Wakefield said, "do you have documentation of these incidents?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have photographs of the fake permits, recordings of the harassing phone calls, copies of all the fraudulent letters, and written statements from 5 neighbors who were contacted by Mr. Henley's associates as part of what appears to be a systematic campaign to identify and target elderly property owners." I handed the binder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Wakefield spent several minutes reviewing the evidence, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she looked up, her eyes were focused on Brad with unmistakable disapproval. "Mr. Henley," she said, "this is quite an extensive collection of documentation. Do you have any explanation for these activities?" Brad's attorney jumped up before his client could respond. "Your Honor, my client maintains that all of his communications with Mrs. Thompson were legitimate business inquiries. Mr. Henley is a successful real estate developer who is simply trying to purchase properties for a commercial development project. Any misunderstandings about the nature of his contacts are the result of Mrs. Thompson's misinterpretation of normal business practices. Judge Wakefield looked skeptical. Counselor, are you suggesting that forged government documents and fraudulent construction permits are normal business practices? Your Honor, we dispute Mrs. Thompson's characterization of those documents. My client had no involvement in any alleged permit fraud, and we believe Mrs. Thompson may be confused about the legitimacy of various official notices she received. I felt a surge of indignation at the suggestion that I was too confused to recognize fraud when I saw it. This was exactly the kind of dismissive attitude that Brad had been using to justify his harassment campaign, and I was not going to allow it to go unchallenged. Your Honor, I said, may I respond to that suggestion? Judge Wakefield nodded. Please proceed, Mrs. Thompson. I spent 45 years as an elementary school teacher, which required me to review hundreds of official documents, communicate with multiple government agencies, and maintain detailed records of all my professional activities. I am perfectly capable of distinguishing between legitimate official correspondence and obvious forgeries. I opened my purse and pulled out a folder containing examples of real notices I had received from various city departments over the years, alongside copies of the fake documents that Brad's associates had used to harass me. These are genuine notices from the city about property tax assessments, utility work, and building permits. You can see the official seals, the proper formatting, and the correct contact information. These are the fraudulent documents that were used to intimidate me. The differences are obvious to anyone who knows what legitimate government correspondence looks like. I handed both sets of documents to the bailiff, and Judge Wakefield examined them carefully. The contrast was stark. The real documents had all the proper official markings, while the fake ones contained obvious errors in formatting, spelling, and legal language. Furthermore, I continued, I have taught children for nearly 5 decades, which means I have extensive experience recognizing when someone is lying to me. Mr. Henley's associates consistently provided false information about their identities, their authority, and their reasons for contacting me. Their stories contained contradictions and inconsistencies that would have been obvious to any experienced educator. Brad's attorney objected to my speculation about his client's associates, but Judge Wakefield overruled him and asked me to continue with my testimony. I described the pattern of psychological manipulation that had been used against me, explaining how each contact had been designed to exploit common fears that elderly people have about aging in place. I pointed out that the harassment had escalated systematically, starting with subtle pressure and advancing to outright fraud and criminal trespass when the initial tactics failed to achieve the desired result. Mr. Henley clearly researched my situation and developed a comprehensive campaign to convince me that I was incompetent and unsafe, I said. He used my age and my status as a widow to justify treating me as if I were incapable of making rational decisions about my own property. This is a form of discrimination that targets elderly people specifically because they are perceived as vulnerable and easy to manipulate. I could see that my testimony was having an impact on Judge Wakefield, who was taking detailed notes and asking probing questions about specific incidents. More importantly, I could see that Brad was beginning to look genuinely worried for the first time since the hearing had begun. His confident smirk had been replaced by a tight-lipped expression of concern, and he was whispering urgently to his attorney, who was shaking his head and looking increasingly frustrated. They had apparently expected this hearing to be a routine matter that could be easily dismissed, but instead they were facing a well-documented case of elder abuse with multiple witnesses and extensive evidence. When I finished describing the harassment campaign, Judge Wakefield asked me about the impact these activities had had on my daily life and emotional well-being. This was an opportunity to explain how Brad's tactics had affected me personally, beyond just the legal issues involved. Your Honor, I have lived in my home for 43 years. It contains every happy memory of my marriage and represents the culmination of a lifetime of hard work and careful financial planning. Mr. Henley's harassment campaign has made me feel unsafe and unwelcome in the place where I should feel most secure. I described how the constant pressure and intimidation had disrupted my sleep, increased my anxiety, and made me doubt my own perceptions and decision-making abilities. I explained how the fake official notices had forced me to spend countless hours researching and verifying information that should have been straightforward, and how the fraudulent inspections had made me feel violated and vulnerable in my own home. Most importantly, I said, Mr. Henley's actions represent an attack on my fundamental right to make my own decisions about where and how I want to live. He has attempted to use my age as a weapon against me, suggesting that being 72 years old automatically makes me incompetent and in need of his assistance with decisions I am perfectly capable of making myself. I looked directly at Brad as I spoke these words, and for the first time since I had met him, he seemed to actually see me as a person rather than just an obstacle to his business plans. His expression had shifted from dismissive arrogance to something that might have been shame, though it was difficult to tell if he was genuinely remorseful or just concerned about the legal consequences of his actions. Judge Wakefield asked me several more questions about specific incidents, and I was able to provide detailed answers supported by the extensive documentation I had maintained throughout the harassment campaign. My 45 years of teaching had trained me to keep careful records and present information clearly, skills that were serving me well in this legal setting. When Judge Wakefield asked if I had anything else to add to my testimony, I took a moment to consider what I most wanted her to understand about this case. Your Honor, I want to emphasize that I am not just seeking protection for myself. Mr. Henley's business practices represent a threat to every elderly person in our community who might be targeted by similar harassment campaigns. The evidence shows that he has used these tactics against other seniors, and he will continue to do so unless he faces serious consequences for his illegal behavior. I explained how Linda Morrison and our other neighbors had been contacted by Brad's associates as part of what appeared to be a systematic effort to identify vulnerable elderly property owners throughout the area. I described how these contacts had followed the same pattern of fake concern and information gathering that had been used to target me specifically. Mr. Henley operates on the assumption that elderly people are too confused, too frightened, or too isolated to fight back effectively against his intimidation tactics. He has built his business model around exploiting seniors who lack the resources or knowledge necessary to defend themselves against sophisticated harassment campaigns. I looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with Judge Wakefield, the court reporter, and even Brad's attorney as I delivered my final points. I have been fortunate to have access to legal representation and the educational background necessary to document and challenge Mr. Henley's illegal activities. But many elderly people in our community do not have these advantages. They depend on the legal system to protect them from predators who see age as weakness and assume that senior citizens are easy targets for fraud and manipulation. Judge Wakefield nodded thoughtfully and thanked me for my testimony. As I returned to my seat next to Sarah Chen, I felt a sense of accomplishment that reminded me of the satisfaction I used to experience after delivering a particularly effective lesson to a challenging class. I had presented my case clearly and comprehensively, and I was confident that I had given the judge everything she needed to understand the seriousness of Brad's illegal behavior. Brad's attorney called his client to the witness stand, and I watched with interest as the man who had seemed so confident and intimidating during our private encounters struggled to explain his actions in a legal setting where his usual manipulation tactics were inappropriate and ineffective. Under oath, Brad attempted to portray himself as a legitimate businessman who had simply been trying to help elderly homeowners make informed decisions about their properties. He claimed that all of his contacts with me had been professional and appropriate, and he suggested that I had misinterpreted his genuine concern for my welfare as harassment. I was worried about Mrs. Thompson living alone in such a large house, he said, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone he had used during our phone conversations. I thought I could help her transition to a more appropriate living situation, while also providing her with fair compensation for her property. Judge Wakefield interrupted him. "Mr. Henley, how do you explain the forged documents and fraudulent permits that were used to intimidate Mrs. Thompson?" Brad claimed he had no knowledge of any fraudulent documents and suggested that his associates might have acted without his authorization. He painted himself as a victim of overzealous employees who had exceeded their authority in their efforts to help elderly homeowners address safety concerns. This explanation was immediately undermined when Sarah Chen presented evidence showing that the fake construction company and the non-existent safety inspection service were both registered to addresses associated with Brad's business operations. She also produced phone records showing that the harassing calls had originated from numbers linked to his office. When confronted with this evidence, Brad's testimony became increasingly inconsistent and defensive. He claimed he couldn't remember specific conversations, suggested that Mrs. Thompson might have misunderstood his intentions, and blamed his employees for any illegal activities that might have occurred. Judge Wakefield's questions became more pointed as Brad's credibility crumbled under scrutiny. She asked him to explain why his company had targeted elderly homeowners specifically, why his offers were consistently below market value, and why his business practices had generated multiple complaints from consumer protection agencies. Brad's answers revealed the arrogance and entitlement that had driven his harassment campaign against me. He spoke about elderly homeowners as if they were children who needed guidance making important decisions, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion that his behavior had been inappropriate or illegal. "I was trying to help these people," he insisted. "Many elderly homeowners are living in situations that are unsafe or financially unsustainable. I provide them with options that can improve their quality of life while also meeting legitimate business needs." "Mr. Henley," Judge Wakefield said, "do you believe that elderly people are less capable of making their own decisions about their living situations?" "Well, not exactly, but many seniors do benefit from professional guidance when dealing with complex real estate transactions. They may not understand current market conditions or the full implications of their housing choices." This response perfectly encapsulated the discriminatory attitudes that had motivated Brad's treatment of me and other elderly property owners. He genuinely believed that age automatically reduced a person's capacity for independent decision-making, and he saw himself as providing a necessary service by pressuring seniors to make choices that aligned with his business interests. Judge Wakefield's expression made it clear that she found Brad's testimony unconvincing and his attitudes toward elderly people deeply problematic. When his attorney tried to rehabilitate his credibility by emphasizing his business success and community involvement, she cut the questioning short and called for closing arguments. Sarah Chen delivered a powerful summation that tied together all the evidence we had presented and explained why the restraining order was necessary to protect me and other elderly residents from continued harassment. She emphasized that Brad's behavior constituted a clear pattern of elder abuse that would continue unless the court intervened with meaningful consequences. "Your Honor, Mr. Henley has demonstrated that he views elderly homeowners as easy targets for manipulation and fraud. His business model depends on intimidating seniors into selling their properties for below-market prices through campaigns of harassment that exploit common fears about aging and safety. Mrs. Thompson's case is not an isolated incident. It's part of a systematic pattern of illegal behavior that threatens the welfare of vulnerable adults throughout our community." Sarah requested not only a restraining order, but also an injunction that would prohibit Brad from contacting any homeowner over the age of 65 without their explicit written consent. She argued that his discriminatory practices warranted broad protection for the elderly population that he had been systematically targeting. Brad's attorney's closing argument was weak and unconvincing. He continued to insist that his client's behavior had been misunderstood and that Mrs. Thompson's testimony was unreliable due to her age and emotional state. This strategy backfired spectacularly, as it reinforced exactly the kind of age-based discrimination that Judge Wakefield had already identified as problematic. When both sides had finished their arguments, Judge Wakefield announced that she would issue her ruling immediately rather than taking the matter under advisement. This was unusual and suggested that she found the case straightforward despite its complexity. "I have rarely seen such a clear-cut case of elder abuse and discriminatory business practices," she began. Mr. Henley's testimony reveals a pattern of thinking that treats elderly people as inherently less capable of making rational decisions about their own lives and property. This attitude has manifested in illegal behavior that constitutes harassment, fraud, and violation of fair housing laws. She granted our request for a restraining order and went even further than Sarah had requested in her relief. The order prohibited Brad and all of his associates from contacting me or approaching my property for any reason, and it required him to cease all marketing activities targeting homeowners over the age of 65 throughout Hamilton County. "Furthermore," Judge Wakefield continued, "I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General's Office for Criminal Investigation, and I am ordering Mr. Henley to pay Mrs. Thompson's legal fees and court costs as compensation for the harassment she has endured." The financial award was unexpected but welcome, as it would reimburse me for the considerable expenses I had incurred in defending myself against Brad's harassment campaign. More importantly, the criminal referral meant that he would face serious legal consequences that could include fines and imprisonment if he was convicted of elder abuse charges. As we left the courtroom, Brad avoided eye contact with me, but I could see the shock and anger in his expression. He had clearly expected this hearing to be a minor inconvenience that would be quickly resolved in his favor, but instead, he was facing criminal charges and significant restrictions on his business activities. Outside the courthouse, Sarah congratulated me on my testimony and explained what would happen next in the legal process. The restraining order was effective immediately, which meant that Brad could be arrested if he violated any of its terms. The criminal investigation would be conducted by the Attorney General's office, which had extensive resources and experience prosecuting elder abuse cases. "Margaret, you did something remarkable in there," Sarah said as we walked to her car. "Most elderly people who are targeted by predators like Brad Henley never get the chance to confront their abusers in court. Your courage in fighting back has not only protected you but also created legal precedent that will help protect other seniors from similar harassment." I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as I considered what we had accomplished. Brad Henley had spent months trying to convince me that I was too old and too confused to make my own decisions about my living situation. Instead, I had proven that I was perfectly capable of defending myself against his illegal harassment campaign and holding him accountable for his discriminatory business practices. The victory felt especially meaningful because it vindicated not just my individual rights, but also the dignity and competence of elderly people in general. Brad's defeat sent a clear message that age discrimination would not be tolerated and that seniors had the same right to respect and self-determination as any other members of society. As Sarah drove me home to the Victorian house that I had successfully defended, I thought about the lesson I had taught Brad Henley about the dangers of underestimating people based on their age. He had learned that this 72-year-old retired schoolteacher was much more formidable than he had assumed, and that trying to bully someone with 45 years of classroom experience was a serious tactical error. I also thought about the other elderly people in our community who might benefit from the precedent we had established. The legal protections we had won would make it much more difficult for developers like Brad to target seniors with harassment campaigns, and the criminal charges would serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar business practices. When we pulled into my driveway, I looked up at the house that Robert and I had spent 43 years turning into our dream home. The late afternoon sunlight was filtering through the oak trees, casting dancing shadows on the Victorian gingerbread trim that we had painstakingly restored decades earlier. The garden was beginning to show signs of spring growth, with daffodils pushing up through the mulch and the cherry tree starting to bud. This was my home, my sanctuary, my reward for a lifetime of hard work and careful financial planning. Brad Henley had tried to take it away from me through fraud and intimidation, but he had failed because he had underestimated the strength and determination of the woman he was trying to victimize. As I walked up the front steps to my door, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the legal system that had protected my rights and the community support that had helped me fight back against discrimination. I also felt proud of myself for having the courage to stand up to a bully who thought my age made me an easy target. Inside the house, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room where Robert and I had spent so many peaceful evenings reading and planning for our future. I thought about how he would have reacted to the day's events, and I knew he would have been proud of the way I had defended our home and our values. The phone rang, and I saw that the caller was Linda Morrison, the neighbor who had first alerted me to the broader scope of Brad's harassment campaign. She had been following the court case and wanted to know how the hearing had gone. "Margaret, you're a hero," she said when I described Judge Wakefield's ruling. "You've protected all of us from that terrible man and his illegal business practices. I can't believe how brave you were to take him on in court." I appreciated Linda's kind words, but I didn't feel particularly heroic. I had simply done what needed to be done to protect my rights and my home from someone who thought he could intimidate me into submission. The real heroes were the neighbors who had supported me with their testimony and the legal professionals who had helped me navigate the complex process of seeking justice. That evening, I received calls from several other people who had heard about the court case through the local news coverage. A reporter from the Willowbrook Gazette wanted to interview me about my experience fighting elder abuse, and a representative from the state attorney general's office called to discuss my cooperation with their criminal investigation of Brad Henley's business practices. All of this attention felt overwhelming after months of focusing intensely on building my legal case. But I recognized that speaking publicly about my experience could help other elderly people who might be facing similar harassment campaigns. If my story could prevent even one senior from being victimized by predatory business practices, then the discomfort of media attention would be worthwhile. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how much my life had changed since Brady Henley first knocked on my door with his expensive suit and condescending smile. What had started as a simple attempt to pressure me into selling my home had become a comprehensive education in legal rights, elder abuse, and the importance of fighting back against discrimination. I had learned that age could be used as a weapon against elderly people, but I had also learned that experience and determination could be powerful tools for self-defense. I had discovered that the legal system could protect vulnerable adults from harassment and fraud, but only if they had the courage and resources necessary to seek help when they needed it. Most importantly, I had proven to myself and to everyone who had followed my case that being 72 years old didn't make me helpless or incompetent. I was still the same person who had successfully managed a classroom full of energetic children for 45 years. Still the same woman who had renovated a Victorian house and built a comfortable life through careful planning and hard work. Brad Henley had tried to convince me that my age made me vulnerable and dependent, but instead, I had shown him that my years of experience had made me stronger and more capable than he could have imagined. The education he had received in Judge Wakefield's courtroom would serve him well if he ever again considered targeting elderly people with his predatory business practices. The weeks following the court victory brought changes to my life that I hadn't anticipated when I first decided to fight back against Brad Henley's harassment campaign. The Willowbrook Gazette article about my case generated responses from elderly residents throughout the county who had experienced similar pressure, tactics from various developers and real estate companies. My phone rang constantly with calls from seniors who wanted to share their own stories of being targeted because of their age. One of the most heartbreaking calls came from Eleanor Vasquez, an 80-year-old widow who lived about 15 miles away in the neighboring town of Riverside. Eleanor had been convinced to sell her family home for $30,000 below market value after being told by a development company that the property had foundation problems that would cost more to repair than the house was worth. The supposed foundation issues had been identified by an inspector who claimed to work for the county building department, but was actually an associate of the development company. After Eleanor signed the sale papers, a legitimate structural engineer hired by the new owners found that the foundation was in excellent condition with no problems whatsoever. Eleanor's story was painfully familiar. She had been targeted specifically because she was elderly and living alone, pressured into making a quick decision based on fabricated safety concerns, and convinced that she was too old and inexperienced to understand the complexities of real estate transactions. "Mrs. Thompson," she said during our phone conversation, "I wish I had known about your case before I signed those papers. I thought I had no choice but to sell, but now I realize I was being manipulated by people who saw my age as a weakness they could exploit." I listened to dozens of similar stories over the following weeks, each one representing an elderly person who had been victimized by predatory business practices designed to exploit age-based vulnerabilities. Some had been pressured into selling valuable properties for below-market prices. Others had been convinced to sign expensive contracts for unnecessary home repairs. And still others had been targeted by investment scams that promised to help them manage their finances more effectively. The common thread in all these cases was the assumption that elderly people were inherently less capable of making sound decisions about financial matters. The scammers and predators operated on the belief that age automatically reduced a person's intelligence, judgment, and ability to detect fraud or manipulation. This pattern of discrimination troubled me deeply, not just because of the financial harm it caused to individual victims, but because of the broader message it sent about how society viewed elderly people. If being over 65 automatically made someone a target for exploitation, then aging itself became a form of vulnerability that undermined a person's basic dignity and autonomy. I began working with Sarah Chen to develop a comprehensive response to this problem. We contacted the State Attorney General's office and proposed the creation of a task force focused specifically on protecting elderly residents from predatory business practices. The Attorney General, Maria Santos, was enthusiastic about the idea and invited me to serve on the task force as a community representative. The Elder Protection Task Force held its first meeting 6 weeks after my court victory. The group included representatives from law enforcement, social services, consumer protection agencies, and senior advocacy organizations, along with several elderly residents who had been victims of various forms of financial exploitation. During our initial meeting, we reviewed data showing that elder financial abuse was increasing rapidly throughout the state, with losses totaling more than $50 million annually. The perpetrators ranged from family members who exploited their elderly relatives to sophisticated criminal organizations that operated elaborate schemes targeting seniors specifically. The task force's first major initiative was the development of an educational campaign designed to help elderly residents recognize and report potential fraud or exploitation. We created brochures, organized community workshops, and established a hotline that seniors could call if they suspected they were being targeted by predatory businesses. I volunteered to speak at the community workshops, sharing my experience, with Brad Henley and explaining how I had recognized the warning signs of his harassment campaign. These presentations were emotionally difficult because they required me to relive the stress and anxiety I had experienced during those months of intimidation. But they were also deeply rewarding because they helped other elderly people understand their rights and resources. The workshops were consistently well attended, with senior centers, churches, and community organizations throughout the county requesting presentations. The audiences were engaged and asked thoughtful questions about how to distinguish between legitimate business offers and potential scams. Many attendees shared their own experiences with suspicious contacts from developers, contractors, and investment advisors who had approached them with offers that seemed too good to be true, or pressure tactics that made them uncomfortable. These stories reinforced my belief that the problem was much more widespread than most people realized. 3 months after the task force was established, we received our first major success story. An elderly man named Frank Kowalski called our hotline to report that he was being pressured by a roofing company that claimed his house needed immediate repairs to prevent structural damage. The company's representatives had told him that delays could result in catastrophic failure that would make his home uninhabitable. Frank had attended one of my workshops and recognized the pressure tactics as similar to those I had described in my presentation about Brad Henley. Instead of signing the expensive contract, he called our hotline for advice. The task force investigation revealed that the roofing company was using high-pressure sales tactics, specifically targeting elderly homeowners, manufacturing urgency about non-existent problems, and charging prices that were 3 to 4 times higher than legitimate contractors would charge for similar work. The Attorney General's office filed charges against the company's owners for elder abuse and consumer fraud, and Frank's story was featured in a statewide news article that helped other seniors recognize similar scams. The publicity generated dozens of additional complaints against the same company, leading to a comprehensive investigation that ultimately resulted in criminal convictions and significant financial penalties. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Brad Henley was progressing through the legal system. The Attorney General's office had filed multiple charges, including elder abuse, fraud, harassment, and violation of fair housing laws. Brad's attempts to plea bargain were rejected because prosecutors wanted to send a clear message that elder abuse would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The trial was scheduled for early fall, and I was prepared to testify about my experiences with Brad's harassment campaign. Sarah Chen had warned me that the trial testimony would be more detailed and intensive than my appearance at the restraining order hearing, but I was ready to face whatever questions the defense attorneys might ask. In the months leading up to the trial, I also had to deal with Brad's attempts to circumvent the restraining order and continue his harassment indirectly. He couldn't contact me directly, but he found other ways to try to pressure me into dropping the charges or agreeing to a settlement that would reduce his legal exposure. I began receiving calls from people claiming to represent Brad's interests who wanted to discuss resolving our misunderstanding through mediation rather than criminal prosecution. These callers suggested that pursuing criminal charges was vindictive and that I could achieve better results through negotiation. I recognized these contacts as another form of manipulation designed to convince me that I was being unreasonable in my pursuit of justice. The callers used the same patronizing tone that Brad had employed, suggesting that elderly people should be more forgiving and less focused on punishment than younger, more aggressive plaintiffs. I documented these calls and reported them to the Attorney General's office as potential violations of the restraining order. The prosecutors were able to trace several of the calls back to Brad's business associates, resulting in additional charges for intimidating a witness and violating court orders. These incidents reinforced my determination to see the criminal case through to completion. Brad Henley was still trying to use my age against me, assuming that I would be too tired, too confused, or too intimidated to maintain my commitment to holding him accountable for his illegal behavior. The trial began on a crisp October morning, with Judge Wakefield presiding over the criminal proceedings just as she had handled the restraining order hearing. The courtroom was packed with elderly residents who had followed my case and wanted to show their support for efforts to combat elder abuse. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case that included not only my testimony, but also evidence from other elderly residents who had been targeted by Brad's harassment campaigns. The prosecutors had discovered a pattern of illegal behavior that extended back several years and involved dozens of potential victims throughout the region. When I took the witness stand for the criminal trial, I was more confident and prepared than I had been during the restraining order hearing. I had testified before the Elder Protection Task Force multiple times, spoken at numerous community workshops, and given several interviews to reporters covering the case. The prosecution's questions allowed me to tell my story in even greater detail than I had been able to do during the civil proceedings. I described not only the specific illegal activities that Brad had directed against me, but also the psychological impact of his harassment campaign and the broader implications for elderly people who might be targeted by similar tactics. The defense attorney tried to use the same strategies that had failed during the restraining order hearing, suggesting that I was confused about normal business practices and that my age made me an unreliable witness. These tactics were even less effective in the criminal trial because the prosecution had corroborating evidence from multiple sources and expert testimony about the psychological techniques used in elder abuse cases. When the defense attorney asked me directly whether I might be misremembering some of the details of my interactions with Brad, I looked at him with the same steady gaze I had used to handle disruptive students during my teaching career. "Counselor," I said, "I have spent 45 years remembering the names, faces, and behavioral patterns of thousands of children and their parents. My memory is one of my greatest professional assets, and I can assure you that I remember every detail of Mr. Henley's harassment campaign with perfect clarity." This response drew appreciative murmurs from the elderly spectators in the courtroom and seemed to deflate the defense attorney's strategy of questioning my mental competence. Judge Wakefield had to call for order, but her expression suggested that she was pleased to see me standing up for myself against age-based discrimination. The trial lasted 4 days, with testimony from multiple witnesses and extensive presentation of documentary evidence. The prosecution's case was thorough and compelling, demonstrating not only that Brad had committed the specific crimes he was charged with, but also that his behavior was part of a systematic pattern of targeting elderly victims. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Wakefield sentenced Brad to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation during which he would be prohibited from working in real estate or any business involving contact with elderly clients. The sentence also included a substantial fine and restitution payments to all of the victims who had been identified during the investigation. In my case, the restitution covered not only my legal expenses, but also compensation for the emotional distress and disruption to my life that Brad's harassment had caused. After the trial, I was approached by several news organizations that wanted to feature my story in articles about elder abuse and age discrimination. I agreed to some of these interviews because I believed that publicity could help other elderly people recognize when they were being targeted and encourage them to seek help rather than suffering in silence. The media coverage generated responses from elderly residents throughout the region and even from other states where similar problems were occurring. I received letters from seniors who had been inspired by my story to fight back against various forms of exploitation, and from adult children who had learned to recognize warning signs that their elderly parents might be being targeted. One of the most meaningful responses came from a group of elderly women in a nearby city who had organized their own elder protection committee after reading about my case. They were working with local law enforcement to identify and report suspicious business practices targeting seniors, and they had invited me to speak at their organizational meeting. These women had been inspired by my victory to take proactive steps to protect themselves and their neighbors from predatory businesses. They had developed a telephone tree system for sharing information about suspicious contacts, created a resource list of legitimate contractors and service providers, and established relationships with attorneys who specialized in elder law. Their initiative demonstrated that my fight against Brad Henley had accomplished something much more important than just protecting my individual rights. It had helped create a broader movement of elderly people who were refusing to be victimized and were working together to protect their community from age-based exploitation. The Elder Protection Task Force continued to expand its activities throughout the year following Brad's conviction. We developed new educational materials, organized additional community workshops, and worked with lawmakers to strengthen legal protections for elderly residents who were targeted by predatory businesses. The task force also established partnerships with banking institutions to help identify and prevent financial exploitation of elderly customers. Bank employees were trained to recognize suspicious transactions and to ask appropriate questions when elderly customers seemed to be under pressure to make large withdrawals or transfers. These initiatives produced measurable results within their first year of operation. The number of elder abuse complaints reported to law enforcement increased significantly. Not because more abuse was occurring, but because more elderly people were recognizing exploitation and seeking help. The conviction rate for elder abuse cases also improved as prosecutors developed better strategies for presenting these cases to juries. My role in these efforts evolved from victim to advocate to educator. I continued to speak at workshops and community events, but I also began working directly with elderly residents who were facing various forms of exploitation or discrimination. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was helping other seniors develop the confidence and skills necessary to advocate for themselves. Many elderly people had internalized societal messages about aging that made them doubt their own judgment and capabilities, but with support and encouragement, they were able to recognize their own strength and wisdom. I also worked with Sarah Chen to develop a legal clinic that provided free consultation services to elderly residents who couldn't afford private attorneys. The clinic helped seniors understand their rights, evaluate suspicious business offers, and take appropriate legal action when they had been victimized. The legal clinic handled dozens of cases during its first year, ranging from simple contract disputes to complex financial exploitation schemes. Many of these cases were resolved through negotiation rather than litigation, but the clinic's existence served as a deterrent to businesses that might otherwise target elderly customers. 2 years after my court victory, I was invited to speak at a national conference on elder abuse prevention. The conference brought together experts from across the country who were working to develop comprehensive strategies for protecting elderly Americans from various forms of exploitation. My presentation focused on the importance of recognizing that elderly people are not inherently vulnerable, but rather that they become targets because of discriminatory attitudes that treat age as a form of weakness. I argued that the most effective protection against elder abuse was empowering seniors to recognize and respond to exploitation rather than treating them as helpless victims who needed constant protection. The conference audience included researchers, law enforcement officials, social workers, and elderly advocates who were dealing with similar problems in their own communities. Many of them approached me after my presentation to discuss how they could adapt the strategies we had developed in Willowbrook to their own local contexts. These conversations reinforced my belief that the fight against elder abuse required a comprehensive approach that combined legal protections, educational initiatives, and community organizing. No single strategy would be sufficient to address the problem, but coordinated efforts could create an environment where elderly people felt empowered to protect themselves and their neighbors. Looking back on the 3 years that had passed since Brad Henley first knocked on my door, I was amazed by how much my life had changed. What had started as a simple attempt to defend my right to live in my own home had evolved into a comprehensive effort to protect elderly people from discrimination and exploitation. I was still living in the same Victorian house that Robert and I had lovingly restored, still tending the garden where we had planted our dreams, along with our vegetables and flowers. But I was also traveling throughout the region, speaking at conferences and workshops, working with lawyers and prosecutors on elder abuse cases, and helping other seniors find their own voices in fighting back against discrimination. The house itself had become something of a symbol for the broader movement we had created. Reporters and documentary filmmakers visited regularly to interview me about my experiences. And the front porch where Brad had first tried to intimidate me had been photographed for numerous articles about elder abuse prevention. I had kept every piece of correspondence, every legal document, and every news clipping related to my case. The collection filled several file cabinets and represented a comprehensive record of what one elderly woman could accomplish when she decided to fight back against discrimination and exploitation. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was knowing that my victory had helped protect other elderly people from similar harassment. The legal precedents we had established made it more difficult for predatory businesses to target seniors, and the educational programs we had developed were helping elderly residents recognize and respond to potential exploitation. Brad Henley had served his prison sentence and was now working in a completely different field under the supervision of his probation officer. I occasionally saw reports about his activities, but he had apparently learned his lesson about targeting elderly people and was focusing on legitimate business opportunities that didn't involve exploitation or harassment. On quiet evenings, I would sit on my front porch and think about the lessons I had learned from this experience. I had discovered that age could be used as a weapon against elderly people, but I had also learned that experience and determination could be powerful tools for self-defense. Most importantly, I had proven that being 75 years old didn't make me helpless or incompetent. I was still the same person who had successfully managed classrooms full of energetic children, still the same woman who had built a comfortable life through careful planning and hard work. The phone calls from seniors seeking advice had never stopped, and I continued to help elderly residents throughout the region recognize and respond to various forms of exploitation. Each successful case reinforced my belief that elderly people possessed the wisdom and strength necessary to protect themselves when they were given the right tools and support. My story had become part of the national conversation about elder abuse prevention, and I was frequently contacted by researchers and advocates who wanted to understand how ordinary elderly people could fight back effectively against discrimination and exploitation. The Victorian house that had been the center of my battle with Brad Henley had become a place of pilgrimage for elderly activists who wanted to see where one woman had made her stand against age discrimination. I welcomed these visitors and shared my story with anyone who was interested in learning about the power of fighting back against exploitation. As I prepared for bed each night in the house that I had successfully defended, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from victim to advocate to educator. Brad Henley had intended to teach me that elderly people were too weak and confused to protect themselves, but instead, I had taught him and countless others that age could be a source of strength rather than vulnerability. The lesson I hoped other elderly people would take from my experience was that they possessed the wisdom, experience, and determination necessary to protect themselves from exploitation. Age discrimination was real and harmful, but it was not insurmountable when seniors were willing to stand up for their rights and demand the respect they deserved. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 75 years old. I live independently in the home I love, surrounded by the memories of a lifetime of meaningful work and genuine happiness. I have proven that elderly people are not inherently vulnerable, but rather that we become powerful when we refuse to accept discrimination and fight back against those who would exploit us. This is my story, and it's proof that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Sometimes the quiet grandmother with the careful handwriting is the one who will teach you the most expensive lesson of your life about the consequences of targeting people based on their age rather than their character. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.